Americans are looking to be teetering on much higher taxes, or at the very least, some risks of inflation with our finances.
You wonder, why do big corporations love big government? Well, because they can afford to sort of steer things to favor them and kind of kill out their competition. And what is really behind tax law, which is basically, it's favors. It is loopholes. It is put in specifically for certain groups and certain constituencies. There are carve-outs for a lot of different things. It's not as straightforward and as it should be. It's meant also to manipulate certain behaviors, encourage certain behaviors, discourage other behaviors. So it's really more than just tax policy. It's more, it's social policy in a way.
Welcome back, everyone. Now, the Biden administration is looking to roll back a lot of Trump's tax reforms, and also with the bailout packages, with other buying packages, with the infrastructure packages. Americans are looking to be teetering on much higher taxes, or at the very least, some risks of inflation with our finances. Now, here to talk with us about what's really going on with this is Wendy Damron. She's the External Relations Manager for the Convention of States. And Wendy, a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you.
So I understand you have an interesting fascination with taxes, and not many people could say that. Most people, we file their taxes and try to pretend they don't exist for the rest of the year. First off, what made your interest so high in the tax system in the U.S.?
Well, I started young, I guess. I started as an intern with Ernst & Young many years ago when I was 20 years old, and I started in the tax department, and it was really eye-opening for me. I had only done my own, EZ form, working, in a minimum wage job before. So when I got into, and I got introduced into corporate tax and into high wealth individual tax and just not-for-profit tax, all the different areas, and I got to see tax law and what is really behind tax law, which is basically, it's favors. It is loopholes. It is put in specifically for certain groups and certain constituencies. There are carve-outs for a lot of different things. It's not as straightforward and as it should be. It's not. It's meant also to manipulate certain behaviors, encourage certain behaviors, discourage other behaviors. So it's really more than just tax policy. It's more. I would say it's social policy in a way, because obviously what you tax you get less of, and what you subsidize you get more of. So it makes you wonder, what they have in mind when they do certain things.
And this is interesting because this ties into the way the entire financial system works in this country. With the Federal Reserve, for example, with the boom-bust cycles, for example, when they raise interest rates or lower interest rates, that the very things that they tax or choose not to tax, also they can regulate in very much the same ways. Now, it's an interesting game to watch once you start seeing the way it operates, but the way, the ability to get to that level of understanding, it is really difficult to get to. If you were to tell the average American, what it's like once you see how the machine functions with taxes, what would you tell them?
I would say it's disturbing. It's frustrating because you go and you get. Back when I started, it was a huge library full of basically the law books, and you get them out and you read them and you see carve-outs for. It literally will say, here's the tax law, except for if you're a company that was started on this day in this industry, and then this doesn't apply to you. So it's frustrating, and you just basically see how there's just so much more to the tax system than what you hear, and there's so much going on behind the scenes, and it's payoffs, favors to from certain officials to supporters and unions, and it's just it's a frustrating thing. I would love to see just a flat tax, although it would I would not be doing people's taxes anymore probably if we had something as simple as a flat tax, but I would be okay with that because I think that would be the most fair situation that we could have, is just an easy, straightforward, flat tax.
Well, and this issue of favors and kind of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, this is where you get in the real concerning parts of the tax law system. As you mentioned, for example, clauses that say that this tax law does not apply to companies started on this date. You could only assume that was meant for one specific company, and then you have to look at which company that was and how it relates to the person who made the law. Once people start seeing this dynamic, it starts making sense how some of the biggest corporations pay very little in taxes, whereas middle America tends to bear the biggest burden sometimes.
Yes, and those are the corporations that can pay the lobbyists to lobby the people who write the tax law to carve those out. And so they get the favors, and then the small business person, they're stuck paying more because the bigger corporations that have the favors aren't. So it's a real problem, and the big corporations, you wonder, why do big corporations love big government? Well, because they can afford to sort of steer things to favor them and kind of kill out their competition in the meantime. So,
which explains why they are pushing socialist policies, which they're calling it now state capitalism. In other words, the state runs the capitalist systems, where in other words they get subsidies or government favors, and as you mentioned, having that protection, they can kill off mid to low level competition. Now let's step back a bit and talk about what happened under Trump with the tax reforms, because as we saw, a lot of politicians, media outlets, big businesses, maybe not so much the big businesses, some of them, were really pushing back against Trump really hard on this. What did Trump's tax laws actually do in this country? We saw him, for example, trying to change things to encourage companies to come back from manufacturing overseas. We saw different tax reforms. What did you see in terms of how these things actually worked and what they did?
Yeah, so he decreased the corporate tax rate. So we had some of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, and so of course it makes sense for businesses to take their corporations overseas to make their money there, pay the tax there. And so when he decreased the taxes, we really compete, in so many aspects, and one of those aspects is tax level, and that's we don't just compete, with amongst the states, but we compete in the whole world. And so when they brought that money back to this country because we had lower rates, and now I'm afraid that Biden is going to reverse all that, and we're going to see the trend that we had before, which was corporations going overseas, and it makes sense for them to do that, because if you're paying 10% more to have your money here, of course you're going to take it overseas. So, and then as far on the personal side, most everybody got a tax cut, even though maybe they didn't realize it, because what they had was more money coming into their paycheck every month, but they weren't seeing was a big refund at the end, because they were getting more. They're having less withheld, getting more in, but stretched out over that time period, maybe they didn't notice it as much as getting like a bigger check at the end. And so I think some people didn't realize what you need to compare. I saw this a lot online, and it made me crazy. Don't compare the refund you had last year to the refund you get this year. Compare the tax liability you had to the tax liability you had. And I guarantee you the tax liability you had this year in 2020 compared to before Trump's tax cuts was actually lower. But people don't, most people aren't into taxes like I am, so it's not the first thing on their mind. They give their stuff to an H&R Block, and then they say, oh, I didn't get as much of a refund, and they don't even really know where to look on the line to kind of make that comparison. And then if you turn on, the liberal news media, they're going to tell you, oh, you didn't get a break. You got hurt by this, and it wasn't true.
And it's the observing that there's less money coming back on the tax refund, and then the media telling you, framing the narrative of why. And of course, your tax refund is just the extra money the government took from you that they're refunding you with. It's your money they took from you, right?
Yes, and they always say that, well, the rich got more, more of a benefit. Well, because they pay a higher percentage already. So, if you make more, the more you make, the higher percentage they take. So of course it's going to be a higher percentage, but everybody got more money back under that. So it's too bad, because I'm sure that is going to change under the Biden administration. And but what people hear in the news media will be, somehow they'll be convinced that it's actually better. And also people really love the idea of that rich person, paying more money. We're gonna get them. We're gonna punish them. They need to pay more. So they actually will overlook paying a little bit more themselves, as long as that other guy is getting stuck with more. So I think there's a lot of that sort of, trying to, play people against each other. And of course, no one considers themselves as being rich. It's always someone else is rich. So it's not going, when he says tax the rich, that's not going to be me. But we have so much debt now mounting in this country that there's no way they're not going to have to go down into the middle class for more. And they're just promising more and more, more spending.
And speaking of the mounting debt, we just saw 2 multi-trillion-dollar packages for COVID relief get passed. We're seeing a very large infrastructure plan getting pushed through. We're seeing package after package that include really, historic level spending packages. And for a lot of Americans, we can look and say, oh, well, they gave me a $600 check, or maybe they'll give me $2,000. Ooh, but of course, that's your tax money.
Yeah.
And the question is, what does it mean a year down the line once they create that debt? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I was really disappointed, because I had heard that part of the reason, or a good part of the reason, why the Republicans lost in Georgia is that Biden came and said, I'm going to give you $2,000. If you vote for the Democrats, you're going to get $2,000. If you vote for the Republicans, you're not. And that seemed to be the thing that made people vote for the Democrats. And there's no consideration, there's no talk of where is this money coming from? Are we printing it? What are we doing to our children? What are we doing to our grandchildren? How are they going to pay this back? There's a lot of talk for college students. I have 2 young adult children that one is still in college, and there's a lot of talk of, well, we're going to write off your college debt, and I just tell her, well, here's the thing. Someday, if you take out a student loan, someday you will pay that back. But if the government pays it, you will be paying that for the rest of your life until you die, because you're going to be repaying it in taxes over and over and over again. It's just going to keep coming back, and it'll never be paid off. So this is not actually something that you want. They're basically paying your college debt on a credit card, and then you are going to receive the bill in 20 years. So I try to explain it to them that way, but yeah, it's really frightening to me when I see and I think people think this can't happen in our country. What's happened in other countries with inflation, with printing money, and somehow it can't happen to us, but of course it can. We cannot continue going on. Our debt is unbelievably high. It's only getting higher. No one's talking about it. And our interest rates are low. What happens when interest rates go up and the interest in our debt goes up?
Well, this is an important point. Can you tell our audience what it means with these interest rates and what it means when you have this type of inflation? Maybe some examples in other countries where this has happened. What is usually the course of action in terms of how things play out?
Well, if you go back in history, you can see Germany, after World War I, before World War II, we saw just skyrocketing inflation, and basically their money became worthless, and they became so desperate that they ended up becoming what they became. The National Socialist Party came, and they were just desperate for any type of change, and we've seen this in some South American countries as well. And you just get to the point that, this is a little bit before my memory, but I know that during the Carter administration, there were skyrocketing interest rates. Since for a long time, when I bought my first house, we paid 7%, and that felt pretty low. Now, what are we down in the 2-3% for a mortgage? But back during the Carter administration, it was like 19%. It was crazy. And so if you think about your buying power with that type of, how it goes down with that type of interest, and then when you think about all the debt that we owe, and if the interest rate goes up on that debt, how it is going to increase again, how much we have to pay back, and how can I explain this? So basically, money is supply and demand. If you have too much supply, the value of it goes down. So when we have all this money being pumped in, the value of that money goes down, and so it takes more of it to buy the things that you need. And it's a very hard cycle to break out of. And it terrifies me that nobody's talking about it. The Republicans really didn't address it when they had the House and the Senate, and the Democrats definitely aren't going to address it. And every single week, I think I hear about another $1 trillion or $2 trillion spending package that they want to push out. And it's, they do it because, it buys votes for them. So it's for them in the short term, it's great. But, by the time Nancy Pelosi, by the time this all hits the fan, Nancy Pelosi may be dead. I don't know. She may not be in power anymore, but she doesn't care because, she's wealthy, her family's wealthy, they'll be fine. But they don't care what it's going to do to the rest of the Americans because all they care about right now is buying those votes with our money. So it's scary.
I guess just last question, what can be done about this? Where do you see things heading with this?
The reason I got involved with Convention of States is because I was so focused on the federal government, and I was so focused on the federal elections. And when I saw the Republicans had been elected to the House and Senate and we had the presidency, I thought, okay, they're gonna do something to address the debt because they've been talking about it for the whole time during the Obama administration. Now they're gonna do something. And then the first thing they did was pass a $1.3 trillion omnibus bill. And the thing that's so frustrating about that is that there's so much waste and there's so much unnecessary spending in these bills. I mean, I think you probably have heard that the last COVID bill was basically 9% COVID spending, and then the rest of it was just pork and spending to other countries and pet projects, and they just don't care. So I just got so frustrated with that I just said, I don't know how we can make them listen. How can we make them do it? And it's so tempting for them because, again, when they get there, and it's a lot easier to get someone to vote for you if you say, I'm going to give you something. It's harder to get someone to vote for you if you say, well, I'm going to protect your future so that 20 years down the road, this economy doesn't collapse. I mean, that doesn't really compute with people who are, feel hurting right now. So I learned about Convention of States, which is a way for this, the founders gave in Article 5 for the states to propose amendments. And one of the types of amendments that they would like to propose are fiscal restraints, so taxing limitations and spending limitations. Not necessarily balanced budget, because a lot of tricks can be done with a balanced budget, including raising taxes, which we don't want. So I see that the only way that they're going to address this is if they either are forced to by the states, or if there's such a groundswell towards a convention that they see the writing on the wall and they say, okay, we need to do this because the American people really, really want this done. So I feel that's the only way that this is going to be addressed. We can try to elect the best people, and we should try to elect the best people and people who care about this. But if you're sending one congressman or 10 congressmen into a group of 435, there's really not a huge dent they can make there. So I feel that we right now have to use the state governments to push back on a lot of what the federal government is doing, which is what, you know, the founders intended in the first place, was for the state governments to be that firewall for the citizens of their states. And I think people sort of forget that the states actually created the federal government, not the other way around. But because the federal government gives so much money to the states, that they really control the states. So for example, in South Carolina, and I think this is true in many of the states, about 60% of the state budget is actually controlled by the federal government in one way, shape, or form, whether it's through grants or regulations, or, you know, there's a bureaucrat in DC making decisions for South Carolina instead of the people of South Carolina making the decisions for what's best for South Carolina. So I learned, and I didn't know this before I got involved with this Convention of States, but that 60% of the state government, of state budget of South Carolina, and this is true of many of the states, is actually controlled by the federal government. So that means that the decisions for South Carolina are being made by probably a bureaucrat in DC who works for one of the federal agencies, who's never actually been to South Carolina, doesn't know anything about South Carolina, instead of the representatives of the people of South Carolina. So that's a problem. So we would like to see that power being shifted back more towards the people of South Carolina.
Just one more question on
Sure.
this. What's the general interest in South Carolina that you've seen for a convention of states?
Well, we have about 50,000 petition signers. We've been working for 7 years to try to get it passed in South Carolina. We have right now 52 co-sponsors on our House bill. We've got 20 co-sponsors on our Senate bill. We have our first hearing next week. So it's looking pretty good. And I think the hardest challenge of getting something like this through is, first of all, educating your state legislators on it, because it can seem like a complicated subject. It's really not, but it can seem complicated. The other thing is that these state legislatures are part-time. So in South Carolina, they basically work January through May, 3 days a week. And they have a lot of issues that they have to tackle in that amount of time. And so if you aren't really pushing your issue, and if you don't have a big grassroots effort to push your issue, or a lobbyist pushing your issue, it's not going to make it to the top of the stack. So you may have a lot of support for it, but it's just never going to get addressed. And it's going to get kicked, the can's going to get kicked down the road. But I think, you know, now with the current administration, I think these Republican states are feeling the pressure to say, what can we do now to push back on what's coming out of DC? So hopefully we'll be able to get it passed through South Carolina. So we've had 15 states right now so far that have passed it. They're all red states, of course, and a lot of them are southern states. So we're hoping South Carolina will be there this year in 2021.
Hey, Wendy Damron, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Well, thank you so much for having me.